Yeah. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, can you hear me? Okay. Is it on? Yeah.
That microphone, ladies and gentlemen, that microphone is purely for the online participants so they can hear things.
Oh, okay.
Nobody are in the room.
Okay. I'm Sarah, the Chief Exec. I'm really sorry I can't join tonight's lecture with the lovely Patrick, but I'm afraid we've got another meeting going on. So I'm going to hand over to my colleague David to formally introduce Patrick, because David knows Patrick well. Have a super evening, and I shall see you at the next lecture. Thank you.
So good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name's Neil. I'm just going to cover some health and safety before David starts. We're not expecting the fire alarm to go off this evening. If the fire alarm should go off and you can keep up with me, we'll get you out nice and safe. If you can't, you're left to your own devices, I'm afraid. So on hearing the alarm, the staff will marshal you outside of the building. All right. So I'll hand over to David. Please enjoy the evening. Thank you.
Right, ladies and gentlemen, as Neil's just said, welcome to Wentworth. The rival Wentworths, Georgian mansions, monuments and landscapes. We couldn't ask for a better person to explain the differences between here and Wentworth Castle. I've known Patrick for many years. It's always immensely interesting when he does a lecture. Over to you.
Oh, you silver-tongued devil. May I just say to begin with that it's a pleasure to be stood in front of real people. For the last 2 years, I've had to figure out how to give Zoom lectures, and I've managed to do about 9 of those, but nothing can make up for talking to real people in a real live situation. So thank you all very much for coming tonight. Of those 9 Zoom talks I gave, I think all of them, except for one, were all promoting the work of the Trust here and the Wentworth together, and Wentworth Woodhouse in particular. So tonight they've dragged me in to talk about the rivalry, the 18th century rivalry, which we are so fortunate has left these 2 complementary landscapes awash with a plethora of monuments, 2 extraordinary country houses and wonderful landscapes. So out of that spat that began in 1695, we have this extraordinary terrain for our leisure in the 21st century. Now, before I go any further, can you all hear me? Yes, you can all hear me. And I do hope you can at least get a glimpse of the screen. I hope I'm not going to be too much in your way. I'll have to be moving the images along. So I'll be coming back to this wonderful bird's eye view in due course, but clearly we've got Wentworth Woodhouse in the foreground and Wentworth Castle in the distance. But all the fuss was about the inheritance of this estate and the house of the great Strafford, the first Earl of Strafford, the strong-arm man for King Charles I, who, for all his loyalty to the crown, ended up by being sacrificed to execution on the eve of the English Civil War, 1641. So this house had a cachet to it. And as you can see, this particular illustration of it is from the 1831 volume by Joseph Hunter on South Yorkshire. Now, in 1695, when the great Strafford's son died, the second Earl, William II, Earl of Strafford, he willed the whole estate, the Wentworth estate, not to the man who was anticipating it, the man who felt it was his legal right to get it, the Yorkshire-born senior male of the Wentworth dynasty. It was willed via the female line, which was unique at the time, to Southerners from Northamptonshire, the Watsons. And so Thomas Watson the first comes and takes possession, and he, as was customary at the time, shoehorns onto his name the name of his benefactors. So he takes the name Thomas Watson Wentworth, and we know him as the first because his son has the same name. So he acquires the great Strafford's house, which apparently was built in circa 1630. Meanwhile, the man who considers himself to be dispossessed, Thomas Wentworth, was scouting around for an estate that was on the edge of the Wentworth Woodhouse estate. And in 1708, he found it. The Stainborough Hall estate outside Barnsley came on the market when the Cutler family went bankrupt, and Thomas Wentworth snapped it up, insisting on secret negotiations in which he called his dispossessing Watson distant cousin Vermin, was his code name. So here we see the Stainborough Hall as built circa 1670. Now, what Vermin does, this is Thomas Watson Wentworth the first, he immediately commemorates his benefactor. And where better to commemorate your benefactor than in the regional cathedral in York Minster. I'm sure you're all aware that cathedrals are renowned for monuments to the local aristocracy and gentry and the well-to-do. And of course, York Minster is no exception. And so Vermin commissioned this wonderful monument in the Baroque style from John Noss I, the London-based sculptor. And it is a gorgeous piece of funerary monument. And you can see just how, almost as though the figures are moving. This is obviously the second Earl of Strafford and his countess. And if you look at them closely, the posture of the feet and of the arms, where the clothes, his outfit is absolutely staggering. Look at those heels. I mean, gosh, they must be 3-4 inch heels he's wearing. But it's almost as though they're in conversation. I'd like you to bear this in mind when we look at another monument in a moment or two. But of course, not only was he commissioning one of the leading sculptors of the day, which says something about your taste, your discernment, and how much money you can spend on sculpture and a funerary monument, but below, on the inscription below, which is profuse, he makes it absolutely crystal clear that he, Vermin, Thomas Watson Wentworth I, is the legal inheritor of Wentworth Woodhouse. So he's not saying it here, he's saying it in York Minster. However, he's so apprehensive of the Thomas Wentworth from Wakefield, or just outside Wakefield, and the fury that Wentworth was heaping down on these rapscallions from down south, that he ducks down behind the parapet and adopts a very low profile here. But he does actually, rather than embellish the house, he practices what one might call good works, and he commissioned the building of the almshouses at Barrow, just outside Wentworth village, circa 1710. Now, on his death, his son, Thomas Watson Wentworth II, little Vermin, commissions another leading London sculptor who has just arrived from Rome, Giovanni Guelfi, who executes the monument to Watson Wentworth I to design by another national designer, William Kent. And it is a beautiful monument. And again, it's in York Minster, and we can see the style of sculpture has changed in the intervening 30 years. It's circa 1731. And it's more neoclassical, but it's also one of the earliest of the monuments in the mid-century fashion to represent the deceased, who is generally the husband, who is accompanied by his surviving widow, who is grieving for his loss. And so if you see one of these grieving widow funerary monuments, you normally say, right, that's mid-18th century. And as you can see, there is a profuse inscription, which again underlines the legality of his father's inheritance from the second Earl of Strafford, and what a jolly good chap he was. But the other really crucial thing about it is that Thomas Watson Wentworth is hugely ambitious. And he has become already by 1728 Baron Moulton, and in 1736 he becomes the Earl of Moulton, and as soon as he becomes the Earl of Moulton, he commissions this print of the statue to circulate in Georgian print culture. And I suppose we have to imagine Georgian print culture as the papers. They were distributed nationally, and they were hot properties sought after, and equally you could dispatch them to as many people as you liked. So I'll be talking more about the use of prints by these two characters. Well, you don't know who the two characters are yet, but by the two protagonists as we go on. But nonetheless, this is a gorgeous statue in York Minster. And the print equally is after the design by William Kent, and it's by George Virtue, the engraver, a leading engraver of the day. So the man who was so aggrieved at being, in his opinion, dispossessed was the Thomas Wentworth. All he got out of his the second Earl of Strafford's will was the title Lord Raby, which brought no land, no possessions, no money, just a title. However, that title was going to be very useful for him. So here we see him at Wentworth Castle, another really fine neoclassical statue, this time by another leading sculptor of the day, Michael Riesbrack. And this has been commissioned in the early 1740s by his son, William, the second Earl of Strafford of the second creation. And it's known as the Strafford Memorial Statue. Now, clearly, what both Vermin, that is Watson Wentworth one, and Thomas Wentworth, the man, what they were both very aware of was that the earldom of Strafford had elapsed in 1695. And both of them began a race to have the earldom renewed, and so that they would get it. Now, Vermin, sadly for the family here, was not an aristocrat at this point. Well, he never became an aristocrat. This is Vermin, the father of Watson Wentworth too, little Vermin. So he remains a commoner, even though he's got this vast estate and this palatial house in South Yorkshire. Whereas he, and equally Vermin, has done he's not done anything significant for the crown. Whereas Thomas Wentworth, who, as we can see, is dressed in the style of a Roman army commander, which was the fashionable way of signifying that the person memorialized had been a general in the British Army. So it's like wearing antique costume to signify your living role. So he rose to be a general in the British Army and a diplomat, and the first ambassador of the British Crown to the latest monarchy created in Europe, which was the Kingdom of Prussia. So he went to Berlin, which was a crucial fulcrum in that first decade of the 18th century. So he's done tons for the crown. He's risked his life in the killing fields of Flanders. His two brothers have died in the army in Flanders, and he's survived that, gone on to become a general, fought in the wars under Marlborough, again in Flanders, become the ambassador in Berlin, has managed to manage extremely delicate situations to keep Prussia on the side in the war against France. So he's been a tip-top chap in terms of what Queen Anne thinks. So Queen Anne thought, yes, you're the man to have the earldom. Equally, he was Lord Raby, so he's already on the lower rungs of the aristocracy. So much to the chagrin of the Watson Wentworths, he revives the earldom. So he's the first Earl of Strafford of the second creation. It's all a bit of a mouthful, I realise, but it's worth bearing that in mind. It saves one confusing him with a chap who lost his head in 1641. But I do want you just to bear in mind, you see here, this obelisk in the park at Wentworth Castle. I shall be returning to that. Now, the interesting thing is that just behind the figure is this this fragment of a column. And in the way that attributes were used to, again, to tell the audience something about the person portrayed, then clearly to be in a Roman army commander's outfit meant general in the British Army, jolly good. And if you were stood with a column, a fractured column, this meant that you were a man of fortitude. That was no great shakes at that time. That was a real accolade to you if you're a man of fortitude. And of course, Thomas Wentworth was a man of fortitude, because he had not only, in his own view and his son's view, been illegally dispossessed of the Wentworth inheritance, but he'd also been a man of fortitude to survive the 1690s in Flanders and the first 5 years of the 18th century in Flanders. And then, as I'll come on to, he managed to endure the punitive ending, most vicious ending of his political career. So he had a lot to swallow, did Thomas Wentworth, first Earl of Strafford of the second creation. So as he is dispossessed and as he's acquired the Stainborough estate right up on the very edge of the Wentworth Woodhouse estate, he sets about creating the palatial home of the Wentworth dynasty. And this wonderful Baroque facade, the east-facing Baroque facade, is a little bit of Berlin in Barnsley. As the British ambassador, he was fascinated by the way that the Prussian monarch projected his newfound status through the use of art and architecture. And the Berlin court at that time was a beacon that attracted artists, musicians, composers, architects from all over Europe. And these two court architects, Johann Eyresander, he was from Sweden, and Jean de Bott was a French Huguenot. So both expats working in Berlin. And so Strafford commissions them to design his country house in Yorkshire. And it is wonderful, as is the interior. It's begun shortly after he acquires Stainborough Hall in 1708. It probably begins about 1709. The actual house is the shells there by 1714, but the interior decor is not finished till 1731. And it is, again, beautiful. And the interiors have survived so well, possibly because it's been a college since the end of the Second World War. But he equally gets these state-of-the-art stuccoists, as we can see, Francesco Vasali and Martino Quadri, and between 1729 and 1731, they execute the fantastic plasterwork. And this Italian staircase at the right-hand end of the building, as you look at it, is an absolute festival of early 18th century plasterwork. But the image I'm showing you here is where Strafford, in a sense, memorializes himself. He becomes an allegory of peace, because as you can see, we've got Perseus, who has been given the mirror shield by the goddess Athena, the adamantine sword by Jove, the boss god, and the winged heels of Mercury, in order to track down the Gorgon, that appalling woman with snakes as hair, who is ravaging the land and whose gaze turns everything organic to stone. So I think we can, well, that's pretty obvious. She's a metaphor for war. And so Strafford, his great claim to fame is that he was Britain's co-negotiator of the epoch-defining Peace of Utrecht in 1713. So here is Strafford being personified as Perseus, executing the Medusa and thus ending war. And he's looking at the snake-haired, decapitated head in the mirror shield so that he doesn't become turned to stone. So I think, equally, it's very worthwhile remembering that Queen Anne, in the popular broadsides of the day, was referred to as the English Palace. That is the English Pallas Athena, the same goddess who dispatched Perseus on this mission in Greek mythology. So the Peace of Utrecht was his defining moment, and the whole the interiors and the exterior and the landscape monuments at Wentworth Castle of his day commemorate the Peace of Utrecht. In the, what was it, the 200th, 300th anniversary of the Peace of Utrecht, I was invited to speak at the University of Utrecht. There's a big conference to commemorate the tercentenary of it, and they were absolutely riveted the fact that in South Yorkshire there was this little bit of Holland. So you've got a bit of Berlin, and then all these monuments commemorating this Dutch town at which this momentous peace treaty was negotiated in 1713. Now, it was so momentous for Britain because the clause of the peace treaty that was most popular was the one where Britain acquired the Spanish asiento. And the Spanish asiento was the major economic goal that Britain fought the war for. And this was to acquire the monopoly contract from the Spanish crown to transport enslaved Africans across the Atlantic to the Spanish Empire. And the British merchants had been yearning to acquire this ever since the days of Hawkins and Drake in the 1560s in the reign of Queen Elizabeth I. And so Strafford is like so many of his contemporaries. He has one of these ultra popular statues known in its day as the Blackamoor, also known as a kneeling slave, a kneeling African supporting a sundial placed in the garden. It's now in the wonderful Victorian Conservatory. It was restored because it was the only survivor of all the Georgian sculpture in the garden at Wentworth Castle. And he publishes prints. As soon as he finishes in he sees the whole process coming to an end in 1730, he commissions two magnificent bird's eye views. And strangely enough, that I was mentioning about the two Prussian court architects who had designed the Baroque house at Wentworth Castle had flummoxed architectural historians throughout this century. And my colleague Michael Charlesworth, working in the British Library, by sheer chance came across this fantastic letter from Strafford to the Queen, saying, who of course had been a German princess, saying, I'm sending you, he's swanking, he's sending her these prints and saying, look at this, oh, this is what I've done in Yorkshire. And he says, you'll have to come and visit one day. And he says, you'll remember my two architects. From your days at the court in Berlin, you will remember Mr. Eyres and you will remember Mr. Bott. And at one moment, this is a wonderful thing about archive research, at one moment, all these problems are just resolved. So Michael hadn't actually gone there looking for that, he'd been looking for something else, and this just popped out. It was a tremendous moment, solving this problem that had been lingering over the place for years. Do note at the top of the garden, the magnificent replica medieval castle, which in 1731, when he renamed this Wentworth Castle, he put the old name, Stainborough, up onto the mock castle and called it Stainborough Castle. And bear in mind, it is a replica. It's not a folly ruin, it's actually a replica castle. It only became ruined in the 1960s when the coal board put another shaft through underneath and the whole thing became destabilized and two towers collapsed. Now, these are the protagonists. So on the left, we've got little vermin, Thomas Watson Wentworth II, the son of the man who inherited. Now, he's really aggravated that his dad has taken so much stick from our man in Berlin. And he's also really fed up that our man in Berlin has been creating this magnificent estate next door. And of course, if you've said to anybody in 18th century Britain, Wentworth, they'd be thinking, that's Strafford's place, Wentworth Castle. They wouldn't be thinking Wentworth Woodhouse. Wentworth Woodhouse was completely eclipsed by the magnificence of the cultural embellishment of this man here. General Thomas Wentworth, first Earl of Strafford, second creation, ambassador at the Prussian court in Berlin. And he's painted here by Paul Carl Lagerby, who, guess what? He's the court painter in Berlin. So he's a man of real swank, dash, and he's doing stuff. Whereas this chap's done pretty much nothing, except he's well in with the head of the Whig party, and that's where he sees his future, by supporting the Whig party. And in 1714, when the Hanoverian dynasty, George I, is imported on the death of Queen Anne, he follows that route, and that is the route to success. So here, I mean, this portrait, I think this is 1714, so he's still a very young man, 2 years before his marriage. When he's married, he's allowed to inhabit the old house at Wentworth Woodhouse, but he is going to show Strafford a thing or two. This is again Strafford in all his regalia of, he's been made a Knight of the Garter by William III. He was an ADC of William III in those ghastly wars in Flanders. And as usual, he uses the media. He has all his portraits engraved and then just distributed around the country. He was for a time First Lord of the Admiralty, and so he has a warship in the background firing a broadside in salute to himself. So clearly Wentworth Woodhouse has got a mountain to climb to even get near to the renown of Wentworth Castle. Now, Strafford's undoing was negotiating the peace treaty. Isn't that extraordinary? You are disgraced, impeached, and impeachment meant, like Strafford's predecessor, the first Earl of Strafford, impeachment meant potential execution. All because he negotiated a peace treaty and brought 11 years of war to an end. You might think he'd get a pat on the back for that, but no, Queen Anne's died, his great patrons died, the Hanoverians have come in, George I is really, really aggravated because Britain took a unilateral decision in 1713 and said, right, all you allies, you're dragging your feet, you're not coming to make peace on the terms we've negotiated, so we're going to go it alone. Britain's got the asiento, that's what Britain wanted. So it cuts and runs in 1713, negotiates a peace, the Dutch come along, but the allies, the Austrians, the Hungarians, the Prussians, even the Prussians and the Hanoverians don't. So George I is furious. All the other allies have to make their own peace negotiations with France over the next couple of years. And they don't get as good a deal as Britain did in 1713. So George I is really furious. There's a general election. The Whigs, because the Hanoverians have now become the monarchs, are on the ascendants because they support the Hanoverian succession. There's a general election, landslide victory for the Whigs, and the Whig government is so vengeful, backed by the king. It fingers 4 cabinet ministers who had a responsibility for the peace treaty. 2 leg it abroad in the nick of time. 1 dies of a heart attack, and Strafford is banged up in the Tower, arrested, locked in the Tower of London for negotiating a peace treaty. So once he's endured all this and he manages to talk himself out of the impeachment, he makes this extraordinary speech in the House of Lords, and they think, well, yeah, why should we impeach you? So the Whigs, to their absolute fury, had to include him in the 1717 Act of, well, you're all jolly good chaps after all, you know, welcome to the Hanoverian regime, which George I, it was a pardon for anybody implicated in the 1715 Jacobite uprising and anybody who was suspected of being a bit not quite with the Hanoverians. So at that point, he's a political exile. His career is over. So he has the time to continue with embellishing Wentworth Castle so lovingly and so beautifully. And in 1734, 20 years after Queen Anne has died, he erects this obelisk at the edge of the estate by the public road. And it is wonderful, the inscription on it. And, you know, as usual, he lists all his positions and ranks under Queen Anne, and he can't resist it. He spends about 3 lines here talking about the fact that he was appointed not only after Berlin to be the ambassador to the Dutch Republic, but also to negotiate the peace treaty. And of course, the Whigs hated the peace treaty. They excoriated it. All the Whig literature of the 20 years after the Peace of Utrecht, damn it, because it didn't win enough. It didn't, emasculate France enough. But so he, every opportunity he has, he says, yeah, I negotiated that peace treaty. And it really is, it's one up. It's a finger, up to George I and the Whig government. And he has a whale of a time doing this, because he goes to court. He's not going to be dismissed from court. And he must be a charming man. He charms everybody at court. But at the same time, he always insists, both in print and in inscriptions, that he was the man of Utrecht. But what he also does on this inscription, and it was for this reason that Historic England in 2017 upgraded the obelisk from grade 2 to grade 2 star, because it has a unique Jacobite inscription on it. The Jacobites, you'll remember, were the supporters of James II, King James II, who was booted out in 1689 by the Glorious Revolution when William III and Mary came to power. Queen Anne was Mary's sister, and now we've brought the Hanoverians in to sustain the Protestant succession of British monarchs. James the second's son, James III, there's only two there, so it should be three, should be James III there. But so he's exiled in France, and Strafford, realizing there's just nowhere to go in Britain for any advancement, he becomes a clandestine conspirator to overthrow the Hanoverian monarchy. And he gives this lovely clue, and it's all about the terminology. So he says on the inscription that he was one of the 7 regents of the kingdom during the absence of the successor. That's a bit provocative. Now, in fact, in 1714, he was appointed one of the Lords Justices between the death of Queen Anne and the accession of George I. Lords Justices, that's what they were called in 1714 in England. But in 1722, it was the exiled James III who appointed him one of the 7 regents of the kingdom during the absence of the successor being the unnamed person on the throne, because that unnamed person, it would be treason to mention their name, because it is James III exiled in France. So it's a very daring statement to put on your obelisk. You can see the mansion at Wentworth Castle up there. Back at Wentworth Woodhouse, Thomas Watson Wentworth II, little vermin, is beginning his cultural counterattack. And you can see here, this is the Baroque front of the mansion. Just in those dotted lines is the Palladian mansion facing east, up there, and facing west is the Baroque one, with this wonderful Baroque garden, which was known throughout the land for this spectacular garden feature here, which was the mount. Mounts were very fashionable in gardens. They became unfashionable probably in the 1720s and 1730s. Just as they're going out of fashion, of course, Watson Wentworth II has to build the biggest one ever. And it's 100, can you believe it's 100 feet high? Every travel guide, every garden guide in the country is just saying, wow, 100 feet high with a little belvedere on top. So if you can manage to stagger your way up these precipitous paths, you can have a breather and look at the surrounding countryside. But he also erects here the Needle's Eye, this magnificent structure on the skyline to the north of Wentworth Woodhouse. I'd like to think it was erected in 1722, as early as that, because architectural historians get really fed up to realize it was actually erected in the 1720s rather than the 1790s. But it was certainly there by 1728, because it's on the 1728 panoramic map. And of course, we have later the Ionic Temple. Ooh, where are we? Here, with the statue of Hercules inside. But what a fantastic garden, because all the footings of that garden vanished after the Second World War with the open cast coal mining, sadly. So there's not even any archaeology there. But do bear in mind these 4 obelisks. We'll see those again. And here we have this magnificent, it's a gorgeous Baroque country house, red brick and stone. And I've just slipped this in because this is the coat of arms up here. And I just wanted to point out around here is the insignia of the Order of the Bath, just as at Wentworth Castle on the architectural facade around the first, around Strafford's coat of arms is the Order of the Garter. Then the Order of the Bath had been set up in 1725 by George I, a specifically Hanoverian order. And one of the first to get it was Thomas Watson Wentworth II here at Wentworth Woodhouse. So that indicates that the king is aware of his loyal service to the Whig and the Hanoverian cause in England. And I think we mustn't forget that this was a very volatile time. In 1722, when Strafford was appointed a regent in the absence of the successor, he was also appointed the commander-in-chief of the Jacobite army north of the River Trent. Now that implies a military insurgency, which was on the cards. It's all planned, and it couldn't have happened at a better time because Britain economically was in a meltdown. The South Sea bubble had occurred. People had lost fortunes, and the government was really unpopular. What a moment for a coup d'etat, for a regime change. But the French, who were going to provide the backup for this, didn't want regime change in England at that time. So they tipped off the British Secret Service and it all came to nothing. But all the aristos implicated in the plot were not charged because the Prime Minister of the day, Walpole, in such a volatile climate, didn't want trials in which the senior people in the land could face execution. He thought, let's get the economy back on track and let's just hush this whole plot. And so fortunately for Strafford, though, I say that, but Strafford's agents who were connecting him to James III in France, one of them was captured and brutally tortured, but never split on Strafford. So they were, as I say, volatile times. The other fascinating thing about these two families at Wentworth Woodhouse and at Wentworth Castle is they do the same thing, almost in tandem, almost like one-upmanship. And so both these are conversation pieces, and they're both circa 1732, and they're both by painters from the same school of English painting in London. So I don't know which one was commissioned first, but here we see the Finch and the Watson Wentworth family. And here we see Thomas Watson Wentworth, two little vermin, wearing the Order of the Bath. And here we've got the other family at Wentworth Castle, or in an interior that evokes Wentworth Castle. And of course, Strafford is wearing the insignia of his top order, the Order of the Garter. And here, of course, is his son, who will become the second Earl of Strafford. They also go in for major landscape improvements. And I suppose the biggest one of the 1730s in both estates were the creation of the serpentine rivers. The one at Wentworth Castle is amazing. It's engineered as a canal along the contour line below the house. It's an extraordinary piece of engineering. The one at Wentworth Woodhouse is cut as a serpentine. Well, it's really a series of pools that create a serpentine riverway. And you can see in this painting of circa 1750 that the serpentine comes round behind here and round here. And I mean, the topography of this is absolutely hallucinogenic. Here is the Huber Stand. Here is the Doric Temple. This is the Palladian front here. And I think we've got up there, we've got the Needle's Eye, and this is the Ionic Temple on the south terrace. Well, that's how they did things. However, you can tell that William Wentworth, who is now the second Earl of Strafford, is a man of great taste because he's got a proper artist, not one of these traveling journeyman artists that Wentworth Woodhouse got, but he's got a proper artist. You just look at that. We'll have a look at this picture again later, but that is a crackerjack painting. Anyway, onwards. Yes, so Wentworth Woodhouse, of course, in terms of the monumentality of the palatial architecture, eclipses anything in the country. It's the longest country house facade in the UK, and it's complete by about 1740. But I just wanted you to look at this print below. It's an exquisite Rococo print, a lovely piece of engraving, and what a gorgeous composition. But do look at the wings. The central block is the same in both images, but it's the wings. And you can see, if you look carefully, that here, now, there's an extra story on the wings. And these were built on in the 1780s by the second Marquis of Rockingham, because he'd become such a super duper grandee that he needed loads of more space for administrators and servants, etc. Now, these are fascinating. Now, it's when you look at these that you realize, well, on the one hand, this rivalry, of course it was dynasty, of course it was about one-upmanship, of course it was one family that considered themselves abused and another family that thought we're on the up. But it was also a national rivalry because both families represented alternative sides of the political divide. So Wentworth Woodhouse, staunchly and loyally Whig here, and Wentworth Castle, Tory. Though the fortunes of the Tories were on the down from 1715 onwards. But these were must-have publications. And they went around Europe and even to the American colonies. And so these are the two major publications about property. One on the left is called Britannia Illustrata, and it is of views of several of the Queen's palaces and also principal seats of nobility and gentry of Great Britain. First edition, 1709. This on the right is Vitruvius Britannicus. Vitruvius being, the name of the great Roman architect who was revived by Palladio, hence we have Palladian architecture in Palladio being a Renaissance Italian architect. So Vitruvius Britannicus is claiming that all the buildings in this book have this lineage of the accuracy, the spirit of antiquity. Now, the fascinating thing about these books is that they run and run into many editions, and the content is sometimes the same, often different in each of them. On the left, Britannia Illustrata had edition after edition after edition until about 1740. Vitruvius Britannicus from 1715 went again into multiple editions into the 1780s. So you can see how important these are. And the way they work, it's ingenious. The publisher was a star entrepreneur because he thought, well, all these people want to promote their power, their status, their possessions. Therefore, I'm going to create a publication whereby they provide the images, they have to go to the artists to get the bird's eye views done, they bring them to me, and they pay for the privilege to be in the book. So these books are collections of properties in which the owners have invested financially in their self-promotion. So when we see Wentworth Woodhouse go up against Wentworth Castle in these, we're talking about people knowing this across the country and around Europe. So it takes it into another dimension altogether. And so Strafford of Wentworth Castle, the first Strafford of the second creation, was really adept. Having been the ambassador in Berlin, he knew how to use art for self-promotion. And as soon as he acquired Wentworth Castle, he immediately sets about commissioning artists to make prints of his possessions. First of all, he does his London property in Twickenham, just upstream from London. And then this is the first of the two ones in Queen Anne's reign, 1711. So he's in the second edition of Britannia Illustrata. And I mean, if you could see, you probably can't at this distance, but that is Wentworth Castle's Baroque front as built, but Berlin in Barnsley. And this is probably the garden and landscape design of George London, who was a royal gardener and a must-have garden designer. So we've already seen Strafford having his portraits made into prints, and he did it prolifically. image after image of himself, and he was commissioning images of Wentworth Castle and other estates that he owned. These are the two he had done in 1730 as the whole project of house and landscape at Wentworth Castle is coming to an end, and they are magnificent. Sadly, all this has gone, this wonderful octagon, Baroque octagon pool with the cascade coming out from a reservoir underneath the terrace. And again, we can see Stainborough Castle at the summit, and we can see how it dominates the skyline here when this print is put in the context of the park and the surrounding estate. So in 1739, when a new edition of Vitruvius Britannicus is publicized, he immediately sends these down to the publishers in London. And he thinks, well, blow me down, I've still got umpteen of these 1713 prints, I'll send those down too. And this is fascinating because this is one of the first reproductions of the design created in Berlin of the Baroque front at Wentworth Castle. And we can see this wonderful Baroque cascade in the foreground, but it's engraved by Costa, and it's the drawings by Holzendorf, who was his political secretary in Berlin. So he's got 3 in the 1739 Vitruvius Britannicus. And then the next year, there's going to be another edition of Britannia Illustrata. So he sends those 3 down, and he says, right, I'm going to get cracking on this one. And he thinks, I've got a print from the late 1720s of my Northampton estate at Boughton. Let's send that one down as well. And then he pulls off his real coup here. And he's already included this print in the 1724 edition of Britannia Illustrata. And that edition, every alternate edition of Britannia Illustrata was in French, French being the lingua franca of the era, which meant it was the international edition. And the French edition of Britannia Illustrata was called La Nouvelle Théâtre de la Grande Bretagne, as though the whole landscape of Britain was a theatre of power, prestige, status, and politics. The French like that kind of thing, I suppose. Anyway, he's having a rip-roaring time here. When I first saw these, when I first looked at these in the British Library, I thought, hang on, this is a mistake. The printers have made a mistake. They put the wrong image in with the wrong title. And in fact, down here, it's called, I think it's called Stanborough. Stanborough. So you think, oh, they've misspelt it and they made a mistake. No, this clearly is not Wentworth Castle at all. And then this is in the 1724 edition, the text was obviously in French, and he's saying the same thing. And these wonderful things where in all the prints, you know, he's publishing the inscription at the bottom, which has all these titles. And because he's revived the earldom, he revives all the titles of that earldom. So he can say, quite legally, that he's Viscount Wentworth of Wentworth Woodhouse. And he's saying that on all these prints and every inscription on architecture, on prints, which must have incensed the Watson Wentworths here at Wentworth Woodhouse. And then again, as we scroll down this, he's saying again, oh, here we go. I'm ambassador to the Dutch Republic, and of course, the peace treaty of Vienna. It's all me, not Vienna, Utrecht. And so he's rubbing the Whigs' noses in it all the time, that he was part of the whole Utrecht experience. And strangely enough, British historians of the British Empire do position the Peace of Utrecht in 1713 as an epoch-defining peace treaty. So whatever the Whigs thought about it, Strafford's come out in the long run as being a, well, I think maybe, I was about to say a good guy. I think that could well come under a certain amount of reanalysis. But here, of course, he calls it Stainsborough. So he's making deliberate spelling errors, and he knows that Little Vermin is going to build a Palladian front. So he pops a Palladian front, claiming it's Wentworth Castle, or Stainborough as it's known then, in the 1724 edition. And then he repeats the same image in the 1740 edition. So I think that, you know, Strafford at Wentworth Castle has a great sense of humour. He's bearing this burden of tremendous loss in terms of, you know, the dynastic inheritance going to these Northamptonshire lads, but he's having a laugh at the same time. And it took me ages to figure that out. And if it wasn't the fact I saw it in 2 editions of the same publication, I would have thought that the 1724 one could well have been an error, but it's not. You know, he's winding up again. He's winding up the Wentworth Woodhouse folks. In this 1739 volume, Little Verbin, Thomas Watson Wentworth II, has now become Baron Moulton in 1728, hence publishing this print in 1728, and he's now the Earl of Moulton. So both Strafford and Moulton are equal in the peerage now, but Wentworth Castle is still the ascendant, is still eclipsing Wentworth Woodhouse. And in fact, I'll call him Moulton now, Thomas Watson Wentworth II. He must again have been really aggrieved because the publisher, as you would in 1739, oh, Wentworth, oh, that's Strafford. So in the contents page at the beginning of this volume, which I just burst out laughing when I read it in the British Library, this is listed as the property of Strafford of Wentworth Castle. So that must really have aggravated the Wentworth Woodhouse folk. However, Moulton, Thomas Watson Wentworth II, is a quick learner, and he cottons on to the fact that Strafford has made all this mileage and that Strafford's reputation culturally around the country is because of his use of media. And so for 1740, whereas Strafford for the 1740 edition of Britannia Illustrata has rustled up 3 prints, Moulton really pushes the boat out. So he republishes this, and he includes this wonderful, oh, look at these again, the 4 obelisks in the Baroque garden. This fantastic panoramic map. At one end of it is the Needle's Eye. At the other end of it is Scholes Wood, where Keppel's Column will be erected. And he thinks, okay, that's 2. How many more can we put in? Right, he said, well, I've got 3 other Yorkshire properties, and I've got prints of them already. And when we look at the dates of these prints, 1726, 1728, you realise that they're coinciding with him becoming a member of the Order of the Bath and getting his baronetcy, becoming Baron Moulton. But we can see on the left is Houghton Roberts, and on the left below is Tankersley Park, and on the right is Carr House. So he said, yeah, let's get those in. That's 5 so far. I bet Strafford hasn't got that many, he thinks, but I'll go one more. And I've got a Northamptonshire property as well. So let's put 2 prints of that one in. And of course, all these prints, like Strafford's prints, let's just go back for a moment. Strafford's prints. See, look at all of them. We've got this where he says he's Thomas Wentworth, Earl of Strafford, Viscount Wentworth of Wentworth Woodhouse on every print that's going across the country and across Europe. So let's just come back to here. Here we go. Whereas, of course, what he's got now is he's got his coat of arms and he's saying that he is Lord Moulton. So he's establishing his presence as an aristocrat. And in this 1740 volume, he's gained the high ground. It's really interesting. This rivalry, you know, Wentworth Castle is at the pinnacle. It eclipses Wentworth Woodhouse. But I think this 1740 volume of Britannia Illustrata is where Wentworth Woodhouse begins to get the ascendancy over Wentworth Castle. And of course, the other moment was 1745, the Jacobite rebellion. Now, because you know, all those whispers about, oh, those Straffords of Wentworth Castle, they're Jacobites back in the 1720s. So my colleague Jane Furs, again working in the British Library, came across these fascinating letters in 1745 where William Wentworth, the 2nd Earl, all his dad's old army chums are writing to him and saying, don't do anything silly, lad. Don't do anything daft like your dad might have done. Don't declare for the Pretender. You know, go to York, where all the aristocracy, gentry, and all the well-to-do of the county of Yorkshire have been brought together by the Bishop of York for this great harangue, this great sort of patriotic, hurrah for George II. down, boo, with Bolly Prince Charlie, etc. And he does. So he saves his bacon. But his mother, bless her, his mother was a diehard Jacobite. And so his mother was in London and she was preparing a party for the Jacobite officers of Bonnie Prince Charles' army once they arrive in London. Now, there must have been a massive amount of hushing up after Culloden to get her off the hook. And it's one of these unpublished stories of what happened. What happened? What happened to the Countess, the Dowager Countess of Strafford? She had a good long life after her husband died in 1739. That's another lovely thing is that Strafford, the first Strafford, never knew that Wentworth Woodhouse eventually got the upper hand. He died in December 1739. He didn't live to see that 1740 edition of Britannia Illustrata. His son was off having a great time in Italy on the Grand Tour. So, why should he care? But of course, Moulton, the Earl of Moulton, was thrilled. So, but Wentworth Woodhouse became a powerhouse of the Hanoverian counterattack against the invading Jacobite army, which was coming down on the other side of the Pennines, and as we know, got as far as Derby, further south than here. And so Wentworth Woodhouse was evacuated, the family moved over to Doncaster, but the house was given over as an intelligence centre. So the Earl of Moulton was sending out riders across the Pennine and observing the passage of the Jacobite army, and all the material information would be collated here and sent up north to the one Hanoverian army up north and to the Duke of Cumberland, who was marching from London on Derby. The young heir, the 18-year-old heir to the Wentworth Woodhouse estate, made a break from it from here, galloped over the Pennines, joined Cumberland's army, and they didn't realise who he was till they got to Carlisle. They'd already fought the Battle of Preston. And all of a sudden, and then of course, riders come from Wentworth Woodhouse saying, send him home. I don't want the heir slaughtered by Jacobites. So the lad was commended for his patriotism and packed off back to Wentworth Woodhouse. But these two paintings are fascinating, because this one here by Morier was actually was composed shortly after the Battle of Culloden outside Inverness. And the Highlanders here are a group of prisoners who were sort of positioned to look all fearsome while Barrel's regiment was doing what they did at Culloden. And here we have Thomas Sandby, who along with his brother Paul was with Cumberland's army. Watercolorist mapped the route for the army. And so here he is, he's just sketching the battlefield. But here at Wentworth Woodhouse, of course, the 45 is commemorated. First with the Doric temple here. And I think what the other thing one must imagine about the whole park here was that there was it was a great gathering point for the militias. And so the Earl of Moulton, being the Lord Lieutenant of the West Riding, was responsible for raising the militia in times of crisis. So he raised the West Riding militias, who were all billeted here. And his chum, John Hobart, who was the Lord Lieutenant of Norfolk, had equally raised the Norfolk militia and marched up here, and was among the other militias who were encamped here at Wentworth Woodhouse. And over some pretty boozy evening meal in here, Hobart said, what about a monument to commemorate our endeavours? And how about putting it on that Temple Hill? Which, of course, Moulton acknowledges in his rent rolls that itemises all the architectural embellishments of his landscape. So we know that this, in a sense, commemorates the presence of the militia at Wentworth Woodhouse, and it was proposed by John Hobart, Lord Lieutenant of Norfolk. Both Moulton and Hobart both became ennobled, or with Moulton got further ennobled for their loyalty during the 45. Hobart became the Earl of Buckingham, and Moulton became the first Marquis of Rockingham. He chooses the name of that down south place in Northamptonshire, where the Watsons came from back in 1695. And of course, the Huber stand commemorates that inscription over the entrance to this wonderful triangular tower, the triangular tower that represents the 3-in-1 motto of the order of the Bath, but also represents the three kingdoms, as they were called in the 18th century, of England, Scotland, and Ireland. And it's a wonderful, I'm sure you will know, it's a brilliant view from the top of the Prospect Tower. But the inscription, part of it says, if I can read my own typing, a most unnatural rebellion is subdued in 1746, and peace in Europe is settled in 1748. Because, of course, as far as the French were concerned, Bonnie Prince Charlie, sending him off to Scotland, was a brilliant strategic distraction for Britain. The British Army had to leave Flanders, which allowed the French to sweep over Flanders in order to contain Bonnie Prince Charlie. So as an episode in a world war, it worked brilliantly for the French. But of course, by 1748, we had the Peace of Aix-la-Chapelle, and the status quo was restored in Europe. Now then, well, I'm sure we're all familiar with these. These are we have here the, what do you call it? The needle's eye, isn't it? Needle's eye, which we can see just here in silhouette. And then we have here, we have the Doric temple, which we see here on Temple Hill above the Palladian facade, and the Huber stand, which we see just up here on the right. And this interesting one here, Hoyland Low Stand, which is way off this bird's eye view. But as far as I'm concerned, this is the last monument of the rivalry. It was erected by the Earl of Moulton, who is now the first Marquis of Rockingham. This is the old little vermin, Thomas Watson Wentworth II. He's now the first Marquis of Rockingham, who's really sort of become elevated in his own lifetime. And he builds it. It's purported to be a hunting lodge, but also you get a crackerjack view from it. And he can see Wentworth Castle from it, Wentworth Castle estate. From no other monument up to that point on the Wentworth Woodhouse estate could you see anything at Wentworth Castle. But by building that at Hoyland, he can see the whole of Wentworth Castle, which again must have been an irritation to the second Earl of Strafford at Wentworth Castle. So again, that's built in the very year that the first Marquis of Rockingham dies. His son, who is a major national political player, he is the leader of the opposition to George III's governments. He, particularly against the American War, the war to suppress the American colonists, as Keppel Column is a monument from that war. And then we come to the wonderful Rockingham Monument, which is the beginning of the Fitzwilliam era, which I will come back to in a moment or two. So we're now moving from Wentworth Woodhouse over to Wentworth Castle. And we're looking at the two successors. On the left, the painting by Bardwell of the second Earl of Strafford, William Wentworth, the second Earl of Strafford, the second creation, and this magnificent portrait by Reynolds of the second Marquis of Rockingham. So he's not only leader of the opposition, but twice Prime Minister. So you can just see again how the status of Wentworth Woodhouse is really rising now in the time of the second Marquis of Rockingham. And you begin to think, well, did the rivalry continue? You think, well, did they have time to be rivals? And what you certainly get the impression is that the second Marquis of Rockingham was a very principled man, and who loves his country estate, loves the GGs, horse riding. I mean, he commissioned Stubbs, all those wonderful portraits of horses, of stallions by Stubbs. But a whistle jacket, I want just need to mention that one portrait. But his innovations at Wentworth Woodhouse are eulogized by Arthur Young in a 6-month tour through the north of England in 1769. And the achievements in the landscape at Wentworth Castle by the second Earl of Strafford are eulogized by his childhood chum, Horace Walpole, in the History of the Modern Taste of Gardening, published in 1771 and 1786. And this really because Walpole was such a tastemaker, positions the second Earl as one of the great kind of connoisseurial pioneers of the landscape garden in England. And we can see what he's doing. He's commissioning Thomas Bardwell again to do these wonderful paintings of his enhanced landscape. If you think under here is that Baroque octagon pool, probably still under there somewhere. So we've got these magnificent, modern, ultra tasteful, a la Capability Brown, parkland landscapes with all the kind of things you need, sheep and deer. Now, but he also creates a theatre of follies on all the skylines around Wentworth Castle. And if we just look along here, you might just discern turrets and tumble down walls, which is this extraordinary thing that ran for a mile along the eastern horizon from Wentworth Woodhouse, and which Horace Walpole described as the ruins of an imaginary city. And if you're keen at hunting these out, there's still 2 towers out there, very tumble down, but there's still 2 towers out there. But it was an extraordinary structure, and it must have been one of the most ambitious follies ever constructed in the country. But he also at Wentworth Castle, because the second Earl William was an amateur architect, a keen aesthetician, his own landscape designer, he designed this wonderful Palladian front on the south. This front here to the east is the Baroque mini Berlin. This is the Palladian by the second Earl. There's a Victorian extension here, and this is the original house, sandwiched in the centre, the 1670s house. So William is really keen on landscape improvements, and you can see all these features that he has. So not only this south front, this Corinthian temple, this column topped by a Minerva, no, it's not a Minerva, it's Pallas Athena, commemorating his father-in-law, the Duke of Argyll, this rotunda. He's extended the Serpentine Lake, he's put a Palladian bridge over it, he's got this wonderful Gothic lodge here, and he's also rebuilt the mock castle. It was done so hurriedly in the late 1620s that it began to fall apart in the 1750s, so he rebuilt that. And he also put on top of this a representation of the sun, of the Enlightenment, and dedicated that his father's obelisk to Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, who, as you know, was the person who pioneered vaccination where you scraped as a remedy against smallpox, which was the major killer in Europe. He even went to see Lady Mary when she was in self-imposed exile in Rome, and you imagine what the conversation would have been like. He must have said to her, "Thank you," because one branch of that family was wiped out by smallpox because they weren't vaccinated, but his line of the family all lived because his father and mother had all the children vaccinated. It's rather a contemporary story, that's it. So I'm coming to the end. It's all right. Relax, I'm coming to the end. And I just want to, well, I hope I am, I think I am, but having, oops, yes, I am. Having roamed around Wentworth Castle and Wentworth Woodhouse, I do want to concentrate, oops, for the moment. I've lost, there's that button, on this magnificent monument. I really want to focus on this because we're all so familiar with this megalomaniacal Palladian front here, which certainly speaks of power and presence. But that's all the 2 Marquesses of Rockingham, whereas this wonderful monument commemorates the 2nd Marquess of Rockingham, but it's the arrival of the Fitzwilliams, because the 2nd Marquess died without children, and so he willed the estate to the 4th Earl Fitzwilliam. He died in 1782. And here it is. It is absolutely magnificent. You'll all be familiar with it. It is absolutely wonderful. And we can see when the doors are open, you can see the statue of the second Marquis stood inside, and the sepulchre that is symbolic, of course. There's no body there. There's no body there. He's buried in York Minster. So the accidental calling of it as a mausoleum is completely incorrect. And in fact, there are two inscriptions on it. There's one around the top here, and again on the pedestal inside, and they both proclaim monument. This monument was erected by, and inside this is a fantastic inscription here. I'll have to get close up, I'm afraid, to read it. And it ends, this is written by Edmund Burke, his political secretary. Let his successors, who daily behold this monument, consider that it was not built to entertain the eye, but to instruct the mind. Let them reflect that their conduct will make it their glory or their reproach. Let them feel that similarity of manners, not proximity of blood, gives them an interest in this statue. Remember, resemble, persevere. And this again, it's by Joseph Nollekens, one of the most, well, a legendary sculpture from the second half of the 18th century. And oh, yes, because he had opposed the war in America, then the inscription by another Rockingham Whig, Frederick Montague, emphasizes in the course, it says, no fields of blood by laurels ill repaid, no plundered provinces disturb his shade. So he's distancing himself. He's saying, okay, I'm a patriotic Brit, but I'm distancing myself from the royal policies of the 1770s and the early 1780s. And in fact, it was Rockingham's administration, his second administration, that began the peace negotiations with the victorious colonists. And of course, Nollekens has dignified the second Marquis by comparing the posture to this classic and so well-known statue of the Emperor Augustus. If you just look at the posture there, and he's surrounded by his principal political colleagues. We've got Admiral Keppel, Charles James Fox, James Lee, Lord John Cavendish, and the Duke of Portland, who took over as the head of this coterie, and Frederick Montague, and we've got Sir George Savile, another wonderful statue of Sir George Savile in York Minster, and we've got Edmund Burke. So here we are, this wonderful monument. So it began being erected in the late 1780s and was completed with all the sculpture and decoration in it in the early 1790s. And I think that alignment of the Palladian front and the Rockingham monument, it kind of signifies the ascendancy of Wentworth Woodhouse. There we are. So thank you for your patience.
Right, ladies and gentlemen, once again by Patrick, an immensely interesting talk. You could listen to him. I certainly could listen to him all evening. I've heard him before, each time. Totally intriguing, totally believable. It's all facts, it's all true. But the way that he puts it across as well just keeps you spellbound all the way through. Any questions, anybody? Please, yes.
Is Wentworth Castle ever open to the public?
Do you know that? Not me. Is Wentworth Castle ever open to the public, Patrick?
It is. Wentworth Castle is now in the possession of the National Trust.
Yeah, can you go in the house?
Ah, that's a good point. Yes. Now, you'll probably remember the days of the Heritage Trust that restored the whole place. Because we re-roofed the whole building and saved the building, then the Northern College had to allow access, and we had it open once a week throughout the summer. But I don't know what's happening now since the National Trust have taken over.
I might know a little bit. Plans are afoot to work the castle, the Woodhouse, the gardens, Barnsley Council, to eventually have certain access.
Well, that would be fabulous if yes, that would be brilliant if one could get into the house.
Keep an eye on the press.
It's well worth
Watch our
it.
website. Watch the National Trust website up there. Hopefully, within the next couple couple of years or so, things will be happening. Next, please. Anybody else? Lady down there.
Why was the estate and the inheritance passed to the female line?
That is the $64,000 question. And strangely enough, no one's found the answer out,
You mean here? Or
which is very frustrating.
You mean
In
here?
1695, when the second Earl of Strafford willed it down the female line to those Watsons in Northamptonshire.
We tend to think it may be that he liked him.
Or maybe she was a very dominating wife. Who
No, his
knows?
sister.
Sister? Yes.
Yeah.
Anyway, I mean, she certainly seemed to, well, it all depends what you want to think, doesn't it? But I don't know the actual reason.
Anyone else? Any online, Andrew? I've got one for you.
Oh, have you?
The
Right.
mound.
Yes.
Any idea when it disappeared?
That is that's equally fascinating. And I mean, if you'd have read, say, Daniel Defoe, you know, the novelist Gulliver's Travel, he wrote a guide to the whole island, and this was very, very popular. And once it went into a second edition, he also introduced tourist information. The first edition was all economic information. They started putting information in about places to visit. And of course, Wentworth Woodhouse was here, and he said, wow, you know, that mount, you've got to go and see that 100-foot-high mount. But the trouble is, this book was printed and printed and printed and printed over and over again, and nobody bothered to edit the information that Defoe put in the 1720s. So even the 1760s editions of this book are still saying, wow, there's a great mount at Wentworth Woodhouse. But of course, it had gone by then. You know, it had probably subsided by the 1740s. And certainly when you look in the 1770s surveys of the estate, which were all up in they're gorgeous things, up in the estate office, in the Fitzwilliam Wentworth estate office in the village, then you can just see that, you know, it says in little letters, the mount. And you can imagine it's really sort of come down, and it's just a bump by the 1770s.
I'm going to throw a possible answer into the equation.
Oh,
You said on the screen, the mount was there in the 1720s. By the 1730s, it was old-fashioned, it was out of date. But 1734, they were starting to build the terrace. Possibly, Mick Jackanory, was the mound used to backfill the terrace to raise the garden up.
well, that's interesting, because between the terrace and the mount, it would have been fabulous, because I mean that whole south terrace was built as a promenade walk to get the view down into the valley, and they cut rides through the woods so you could see the lakes at the bottom. So I guess you couldn't promenade on the mount, you know, and you just had the little sort of belvedere on the top. Yeah, so I think that probably, you know, that probably captures a shift in taste, doesn't it? I think that's in the early
Times move forward
1730s.
and times
Yes.
evolve and things go in and out of fashion.
Yes.
Do we know this?
Oh, hang on, I'll have to come and
Hang on, let me bring the mic.
I'll turn my ears up to full
You're
volume.
wired up.
Right.
Do we know the source of the wealth of
Sorry, I
either
can't
the?
hear at all.
Do we know the source of the wealth of either of these two houses? Was it agricultural? Was it slavery? Was it exploitation, theft? What? Where did they get their money from?
Combination
build
of
it.
all of those.
Do you have any
Well,
actual facts
I
about
don't
any
know
of
about
them?
Wentworth Woodhouse. I mean,
I can do that.
what?
I can do that one.
I mean,
You're the
certainly
castle.
Wentworth Woodhouse was hugely successful. Can you all hear me? I'll totter back to the front. Wentworth Woodhouse, certainly under both the Marquesses of Rockingham, Wentworth Woodhouse made agriculture, estate agriculture, into a really profit-making enterprise. And Wentworth Woodhouse was seen as one of the leading estates of the new agriculture, of the agricultural revolution. So certainly Wentworth Woodhouse had, you know, agriculture and rents was a major source of income. But they also had estates in Ireland and across the UK. So they had income from all those other estates as well. And by the 1790s, they were beginning to develop deep mining. Once they'd put a steam engine in at the head of the coal field down the hill at Elsica. And by the early 19th century, then coal mining here was the principal source of income. Now, in terms of the slavery one here, I would say they would have received some income from slavery because everybody in polite society in Georgia and England invested in international companies, stock market. And the major companies were the East India Company, the South Sea Company, the Royal Africa Company, the French Mississippi Company, etc., all of which were slaving companies. So in that way, by getting dividends on their investments in these companies, they were involved in the Atlantic slave economy. Here, I'm speculating at Wentworth Woodhouse. If they are representative of the norm of the investment practices of members of polite society, then Wentworth Woodhouse will have benefited to some extent from income from the Atlantic slave economy. At Wentworth Castle, it was major. Now, I gave a talk, strangely enough, for the Gardens Trust on your precise question. Where did the money come from? Now, I spent an hour answering that question. So I don't think I've got quite that long at the moment. So I'll try to, again, there's all sorts of sinecures and jobs for which you get income, as well as the possession of land, which brings income from tenants. And if you're smart at looking after your agriculture, then that can be profitable. But at Wentworth Castle, they had significant income from the slave trade. And it wasn't that they were necessarily, well, of course, the first Strafford was investing in those companies I mentioned. So he was getting a return on all those companies. But he inherited through his wife. His wife's father had been a major shipbuilder, and he'd owned the great and profitable Blackwall shipbuilding yard on the Thames in London. And all the ships he built were for the companies that I've mentioned. So most of the ships he was building were slaving ships. He was also a principal member. This is Strafford's father-in-law, was a principal member of the Royal African Company. He's probably a chum of Colston in Bristol, who was also a member of the Royal African Company. And also the father-in-law's brother was a member of the Royal African Company, and he had for a time been in charge of one of the slaving forts on the west coast of Africa, marshalling the poor Africans to be herded into ships and sent across the Atlantic. So the investment, the inheritance, when the father-in-law died in the early 20s, was colossal. And it all came from the Atlantic slave economy. And I mean, that would have been a massive shot in the arm for completing the house at Wentworth Castle, and investing in the landscape design. In fact, if you look on the National Trust website for Wentworth Castle Gardens, as they call it, they actually do summarize the income from slavery that the Straffords benefited from in the early 18th century.
When did their fortunes start to change? When the money was going?
Sorry.
When did the fortune start? You mean here or there?
Here.
When did what?
When their fortunes start to change and the money was disappearing.
Well, between the two places.
Yeah.
Well, I'd say it was 1740. 1740.
You mean
And
that last century, don't you?
Yes.
Yeah. More
Yeah.
pre-war.
Yeah.
Second World
oh,
War,
sorry, do you mean now?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, no, from when the houses were built and then everybody's having a wonderful life and all this landscaping and architecture was going on, but then the money at some point was starting to run away for both of the buildings.
Well, of course, here they suffered successive family tragedies, didn't they? And had massive, what do you call it? The tax you have to pay, death duties. Yeah, and then the place became a teacher training college, you know, in the post-war era, late 1940s, as did Wentworth Castle, of course, did as well.
Can I interrupt that one?
What?
Can I interrupt that one?
You can.
I don't follow that. In the 1902, 6th Earl Fitzwilliam died, left nearly £3 million. 1933, Billy Fitzwilliam, 7th Earl, set up 4 companies, each worth £1 million. He died in 1943, 10 years later. he only left 1.2 million. But yet his son Peter, the 8th Earl, could buy an estate down in Hampshire. He could buy Warren Towers at Newmarket. He could pay the highest price ever paid for a racehorse at Tattersall's. But when he died in 48, he only left £800,000. But the year before, on the nationalisation of the coal authority, coal mines, they'd got over 2.5 million in compensation. I think it's smoke and mirrors. I think it's more to do with here, you've got to have servants. After the Second World War, people didn't want to go into service. I think the family was still immensely wealthy. Yes, there were death duties, 3 lots of death duties in 10 years. But you look at the wills and the death duties don't tie up with the money that was there and to a certain extent is still around.
Good.
Does that make sense?
That makes sense. Makes sense to me. Does it make sense to you? Jolly good.
Over
There
to
you
you
are.
now for Wentworth Castle.
Oh, you mean the 20th century of Wentworth
Mr.
Castle?
Vernon Wentworth.
Yeah. Well, there still is a Mr. Vernon Wentworth, isn't there, in Suffolk,
Mm.
who they had several estates, the Yorkshire one, and then in Scotland, which is connected with the Argylls, and in Friston on the Suffolk coast, and that one has been kept. So the Vernon Wentworths still live there, and when Wentworth Castle was, when the restoration began at the beginning of this century, the Vernon Wentworths, in order to avoid taxation, gifted the whole parkland at Wentworth Woodhouse to the trust that did the restoration, and that's now been passed on via Barnsley Council to the National Trust. So that was a very beneficial arrangement for the Vernon Wentworths at the beginning of this century. But yeah, I suppose there's just been a gradual decline, I suppose. I mean, if you think in the late 19th century, when the wonderful conservatory was built, which was one of the first conservatories to have electrical lighting in it, and very sort of exotic electrical lighting it was. And the house was, I think, the first house after Buckingham Palace to have electricity installed. That was all to lure the younger royals up to Wentworth Castle, so they would have this cachet of entertaining the royals, because they kept a very good shoot, and the young royals would come up for the shooting. So clearly by the 1880s, Wentworth Castle had a bit of a cachet, but that all sort of declined through the 20th century to the point where the incumbent after the Second World War was very happy to sell it to Barnsley Council, who converted it into a teacher training college.
Anybody else? Any more questions? Anyone? Well, once again, I'm sure we'd like to thank Patrick for a wonderful lecture. It's always good to listen to him. We've one more lecture in this series, which is in 2 weeks, and I can't remember which one it is. It's about Baroque and something else, and something like that. Anyway, it's been an immensely successful series.
House of Baroque. This is the font of all knowledge behind me.
Good. And what's it about? Right. That's in 2 weeks. Please come and support us. Thank you for visiting tonight. Safe journey home. Thanks again to Patrick, who, as we say, hopefully we're getting back to something else. Hopefully you've enjoyed it. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.